Welcome back, y'all! Since before X-Men 97 Season 2 even hit our screens, we've been slowly working our way through this show's roster, one anatomy at a time. And today we're finally getting to someone who's been floating in the background of this show since Season 1, or you can say even before that from the original series, waiting for her moment. Green hair, magnetic powers strong enough to fling entire islands into space, and a family tree so tangled that Marvel needed 3 decades and a DNA test to sort it out. Yes, today we're breaking down the magnetic anatomy of Lorna Dane, better known as Polaris. If you only know her as Magneto's daughter and nothing else, then you have definitely come to the right place. This is a woman who's been possessed by a body-snatching villain for years without escape, had her powers stolen by her own half-sister, and spent her entire life fighting not to become the very man she's compared to. So without wasting any more time, let's get into it, shall we? Is Magneto really Polaris' father, or was that one of Marvel's longest retcons? However, before we even touch on all of the things that Polaris can do with magnetism, I feel like we need to address the one thing that has baffled people with her origins. Yep, I am talking about this woman's family tree. Sure, Magneto's supposed parentage of Polaris should sound pretty direct, but somehow Marvel ended up with what was considered one of the biggest puzzles in X-Men history, for decades no less. On one hand, if you have been watching the new X-Men 97 series, then it's likely you know that Magneto is the father of Lorna. The end of that. On the contrary, the actual comics never made it as straightforward. When Polaris first landed in X-Men number 49, the first issue hinting at the idea of her being Magneto's child, it seemed like this was not going to take long to confirm. But issue number 50 all but seemed to already give readers the answer, as it really left no questions about the fact. Well, that had not exactly panned out as everyone thought. Only several issues later, it had turned out that Magneto in that story actually hadn't been the master of magnetism. It was, in fact, an imposter for the Magneto bot. It returned the entire plot to square one, leaving her actual relationship with the master of magnetism one of the most ambiguous facts about the character. One that seemed to take the powers that be from Marvel almost as long to clear up as it took to get the plot out, until finally issue number 431 of the Uncanny X-Men, 30 plus years after her original debut, confirmed that by doing a DNA test, later stories would also fill in the rest of Lorna's origin, revealing that her mother, Zaladane, had an affair with Magneto before Lorna was born. Years later, a tragic plane crash claimed the lives of her parents. During the disaster, Lorna's dormant magnetic powers erupted in a massive burst of magnetic energy, leaving her orphaned before she was eventually adopted by the Dane family. Well, I suppose that it could be said that one good side about it all is that at least X-Men 97 finally spared viewers the 30 plus years of guessing that Marvel put comic readers through. The series made the answer as clear as day. Why is Polaris' hair green, and what does it reveal about how her mutation first activated? To this day, I swear I thought the green hair on Polaris was simply another element of her eccentric comic book appearance and flair, as with any given number of characters who are blessed with absurd aesthetics purely for the sake of awesome. But apparently her shade of green comes with a devastating backstory, and it isn't like Lorna just walked out of the womb sporting bright green hair. This came to be when, as a little girl on a flight with her parents, a traumatic event mid-air triggered an outbreak of her hidden mutant ability, which ironically produced enough of a magnetic pulse to contribute to the plane going down, killing her parents. Also permanently altered the color of Lorna's hair. Her blonde hair was lost to her mutation, and from that point on, it was forever to remain green, as a symbol of the gift that she was always carrying on the inside, whether she knew it or not. Her adopted parents would have her put blonde dye over it throughout her childhood for an apparent cover-up. But all beneath the coloring and societal camouflage of her adolescence, all of her abilities just continued to mature. This again leaves me wondering if a sudden outburst of raw magnetic power from a little girl could collapse a plane and send it into oblivion. What could you expect from a fully formed mutant like that? Suddenly, her powers stop being a cool visual gimmick and start feeling like something you really need an anatomy breakdown for. How does Polaris' body actually grab, bend, and reshape metal? So we've talked a bit about where her powers are coming from. Now let's talk about what she can do. Most people describe Polaris's powers as mental control over metal. That is absolutely not true. Polaris is moving the magnetism, not controlling the metal directly. She can, however, attract, repel, levitate, and shape metal. The most incredible aspect of her power, according to a variety of sources though, is not really the fact that she can throw cars and rip through buildings, something plenty of other mutants can easily do. This is her power of magnetism itself, her ability over the extremely fine movements that magnetism can achieve. Polaris has demonstrated fine control over magnetism such that she is able to liquefy and reshape metal into incredibly intricate shapes that she can quickly turn into weapons, shields, or even whole armors, much like Magneto often does. It's a form of magnetic manipulation we've heard a lot about and seen Magneto do, but Lorna can obviously do it too. One of my favorite examples of her extreme power is after Havoc calls off their wedding. While in the middle of a breakdown in the middle of the reception, Polaris shreds all of the silverware and quickly shapes it into the classic armor and helmet style of her father, Magneto. All the while, everyone is in chaos, but this is pulled off in the middle of chaos, and it looks to have been done in seconds without any effort. The fact that the precision of her magnetic manipulation is there despite all that could be seen as emotional torment she is dealing with is what makes it really stand out. And really, I believe that what makes Polaris stand out is not the immense scope of what she has done with her powers, though she's done quite a bit. What I think truly sets her apart is her sheer precision. She's got both the huge applications of magnetism that Magneto has shown us, and the ability to create whole steel and metal structures very quickly. On top of that, she's got all the fine control you could want over smaller materials, as shown in my favorite example. Though this is an easy connection to draw, I would be wary of saying that Polaris is really just Magneto all over again. She may be similar, but she's made her powers her own. Can Polaris really reach into a person's blood and control the iron in it? So in short, technically yes, but in a highly conditional way. Now, we've all established that Polaris's powers are less about controlling the metal itself and more about the magnetic fields that hold the metal. One can ask the obvious question: could Polaris control the iron that's in a human body? Again, theoretically yes, but even by extremely rare and difficult standards of magnetic manipulation, the iron in a human body is one of the most complex possible applications. Your body doesn't just have tiny bits of iron hanging about in it. It's an integral part of hemoglobin, whose cells are within our red blood cells. This makes it a much more complex target than, well, a steel beam, or even a car. Part of the reason magnetic mutants like Polaris and Magneto are so imposing is that, in rare cases, this power can extend to the human body itself. The most unusual thing is, Polaris rarely uses it in this manner. Typically, she uses it to control external metal, to generate force fields, or in combat to use magnetism to create magnetic constructs. Magneto, however, is known to have had some far more invasive uses of magnetism in the years, thus showcasing how truly dangerous magnetic powers are under ideal conditions. But we can be happy in the knowledge that Polaris more often than not simply sticks to either throwing automobiles, manipulating force fields, and constructing armor plating, rather than turning people into some kind of science experiment. How does Polaris fly without wings, engines, or wind? We know all the cool things that Polaris can do using magnetism, so it is only natural to ask, how the heck can she fly in the first place? Unlike Superman, who relies on sheer strength to fly and doesn't utilize some kind of hidden engine or thrusters on his suit like Iron Man, what allows Polaris to be off the ground? Polaris flies by manipulating the Earth's magnetic field. Instead of providing propulsion in a conventional sense, Polaris creates her own magnetic field and uses it to push off of Earth's magnetic field. It is basically less like a bird flapping its wings and more like two magnets pushing apart. What I think is even cooler though isn't just that she uses it, it's how aware of the magnetic field she actually is. According to the comics, she can almost sense minute disturbances in the planet's magnetic field just because it's in her nature. It's almost like a sixth sense that only pays attention to this one thing and does absolutely nothing else useful. Another element I always enjoy is how Polaris's flight doesn't quite feel like Magneto's, even though it relies on the same basic power set. It's less about commanding magnetism in the way Magneto does, while she relies more on something innate. Though this isn't a concrete rule so much as what I think matches their portrayals. Basically, she's not just flying, she's also being impacted and manipulated by one of the biggest forces ever, and to me, that makes for a much cooler explanation than any simple "she can fly" statement. So just how powerful is Polaris anyway? So just how powerful can Polaris really be? I can't think of a better way to answer that question than through Giant Size X-Men issue number 1, otherwise known as the Second Genesis storyline. Released in 1975, this issue was responsible for the introduction of the new X-Men team, namely Storm, Wolverine, Nightcrawler, and Colossus, as they journeyed into space to save their predecessors from a sentient living island that goes by the name of Krakoa, not to be confused with the modern nation that shares the name. She was able to absorb the lightning strikes from Storm, the optic blasts from Cyclops, and the energy blasts from Havoc, thanks to her force field. The absorption and redirection of that energy resulted in a single magnetic pulse that was able to propel the entire island of Krakoa into space. Personally, I believe that is the pinnacle of her power because it does not come from her brute strength, rather from the absorption and focusing of the ambient energies in her environment. As I learned about that feat, it also began to occur to me that there was another facet of her powers that I should pay more attention to. If Polaris' link to electromagnetic fields is that deep, it means she should also be able to perceive those fields? Well, turns out she does. While she's concentrated on a task, Polaris doesn't rely solely on the use of her eyesight. Instead, she senses the world through the magnetic fields themselves. That is to say that she can detect magnetic signatures of various people, objects, and electrical current flowing throughout the area around her. Instead of looking at the world as it actually is, she sees it through the unseen energies flowing across the world. And the truly amazing thing is that it's not like her body is just passively picking up on signals. She's literally using the same forces she controls in combination to create fields of power strong enough to shield others, levitate massive objects, and absorb vehicle impact. I think that is something I found to be the most amazing aspect of Polaris. The more I read her story and become aware of the various ways that she can affect the world, the more I realized that she goes beyond being just the mutant who can move metal. Thanks to her ties to the Earth's magnetic field, she can fly, manipulate tremendous quantities of energy, experience the world on a completely new level, as well as protect herself and everyone around her from all harm. So how did this body-stealing monster Malice get trapped in her for all eternity? So her only real superpower is stealing people's bodies. That's literally all that Malice does. She doesn't have to be strong to beat you. She doesn't have to trick you. She just has to jump into you, take over your body, and control everything, which is a nightmare situation. And that's what had happened to Polaris in Uncanny X-Men issue 219. At first glance, it seemed that once again, it was another victory. Malice had indeed seized Polaris' body and began using all her powers, and all that Polaris possessed to fight the X-Men. But here's the difference. She could never leave. This later happened because her power matrix intertwined with that of Malice's. By using Lorna as another temporary host, Malice accidentally fused herself to the one mutant she never intended to stay inside. Honestly, I find it hilarious. You spent your entire career running in and out of people's bodies whenever trouble showed up, and then one time you get stuck inside Magneto's daughter. Anyway, I want to clear up one thing because it gets confused all the time. This means Polaris has no type of mind prison / soul's entrapment powers that she can unleash on people whenever she pleases. It was a special thing between Malice's possessed powers and Polaris's mutant ability. She didn't suddenly get a new superpower after all. The ironic part is she was only freed when one of the High Evolutionary's machines used by Zaladane drained Polaris of her powers. Once that unique energy connection disappeared, so did Malice's prison. That's honestly one of my favorite things about Polaris as a character. She didn't manage to take down one of the X-Men's most villainous psychic threats by hitting them harder or generating a stronger magnetic charge. She succeeded in defeating Malice due to the inherently chaotic nature of her powers, in a manner so completely unexpected that even her target wasn't aware of the trap she had run right into. Did Polaris really have a half-sister who stole her powers and nearly killed her? Great, just what the already very convoluted Polaris family needed. Enter Zaladane. Zaladane was insinuated to be some sort of half-sister to Lorna, though that was one of those many tales that Marvel would conveniently blur. You know how those X-Men families can be? Whatever the case though, Zaladane was always about the same things like acquiring Lorna's powers, ruling the Savage Land at one point in time, teaming up with Brainchild, and utilizing high evolutionary technology Zaladane was eventually able to channel Lorna's magnetic powers into her own, leaving the green-haired goddess bereft of all her unique powers. Pretty horrifying to imagine, don't you think? It's not just that someone stole her powers and walked off with them, it's that they stole a piece of who she is. And because Malice was riding Lorna at the time, all of those energy connections between them got scrambled in the process. In the end, Zaladane walked away with powers she was never meant to have, and Malice's grip on Polaris was gone. It's darkly funny in a way. I mean, someone's greed accidentally cured Polaris of one of her worst possessions while nearly killing her in the process. How do Polaris's powers affect her own mind? Okay, so if you've ever read X-Men comics featuring Polaris, you may have noticed a very specific thing. Every time Lorna loses control, everyone is ready to point at her powers and say, "Oh, it's the powers," and they're only half right. You see, unlike someone like Jean Grey, Polaris doesn't have an established comic book rule like overload equal to madness. Instead, Marvel has been demonstrating for decades how her emotional state is inextricably linked to, but not always the same in relation to, her powers. Her loss of powers is one example of this. When Zaladane took away Lorna's magnetic manipulation capabilities, it wasn't simply, "Oh, I can no longer move things." Imagine if you woke up one day and suddenly lost one of your 5 senses. Magnetism is not simply what Lorna does in battle, it is a sense she has of the physical world that is ever present. Her inability to perceive and manipulate magnetism took away not just a power, but also a fundamental part of her identity and self-perception. Then you have everything else life has been throwing at her too. Malice possessed her, Genosha was destroyed. She constantly had to uncover truth upon truth about her family. She lost and regained control of her own body, lost and regained her powers. To be frank, after looking at her entire history, I'm impressed she is functioning as well as she is. And this, I believe, is where Polaris and Magneto differ. Magneto is always calculated, even when his actions are horrific. Lorna often acts on her emotions and figures out the outcome of that later. When she gets overwhelmed, her powers become more unstable not because magnetism is literally rewiring her brain, but because she is a person suffering massive emotional trauma while possessing one of the most destructive abilities known to the mutant kind. That, to me, is what makes Lorna so incredible. Her most dangerous fight has never been controlling magnetism, it's learning to control herself. What is it about Polaris that stopped her from turning into some other Magneto? With all that I've just shared with you, this is what keeps popping into my head. If Polaris inherited Magneto's abilities, why didn't she become another Magneto? Because I mean, let's face it, it's a bit frightening how much the two have in common. They are able to control magnetic fields with unnaturally precise manipulation. They are both capable of flying, utilizing the planet's magnetic fields. They both can manipulate force fields, shape metal with incredible ease, and virtually turn any war into your worst hell. So where is the separation? Not surprisingly, it wasn't in power either. Instead, it was in their mindset about the world. Everything that Magneto once stood for and every action he had taken in life stemmed from his struggle for survival during the Holocaust. At the time Magneto was introduced in comic book lore, he had already concluded that mutants needed to defend themselves at all costs, which, if you know the comics, by all costs was defined as dominating over humans instead of working hand in hand with them. Nothing Lorna has witnessed or endured would be classified as ordinary. It really wouldn't. Not to mention, she has suffered her fair share of pain and the most traumatic things any person should carry for their entire lives. She has suffered mental attacks and harassment, was tricked and denied her abilities, deceived regarding her parentage, and questions herself numerous times on whether she could even identify herself in this world. But through it all, unlike her dad, she's never ultimately succumbed to letting her fear drive how she treats people. To me, in a lot of ways, that is what makes Polaris so darn compelling. Throughout the comics, she's constantly tempted to become the next Magneto, and people keep telling her that almost every day, other mutants too. They wanted her to step directly into her father's shoes, simply because he was, well, Magneto. However, more often than not, she just doesn't. Instead, Lorna keeps taking her stories in directions that let her figure out who she wants to be, not who her father was. And I will honestly tell you, I do believe that is even more difficult, because controlling magnets is nothing compared to stepping out of the shadow of one of Marvel's most complex and controversial villains. It's a battle that Polaris has been battling for her entire comic life. What was the point of Danger.exe? In X-Men 97 Season 2's episode named Danger EXE, the show finally gives Polaris the kind of spotlight she's been owed for years. The Danger Room becomes fully sentient as Danger and turns on the X-Men, trying to kill Professor X and the students trapped inside, and it's Lorna and Bishop who crash in to save them. Now, this for Polaris isn't just that she gets a cool fight scene. Xavier doesn't just ask her to throw metal around, rather, he opens his mind and actually shares his memories of Magneto with her, the best friend he just watched die in Genosha, and the father she's never really known. For the first time, Lorna stops fighting like someone trying to avoid her lineage and starts fighting like Magneto's daughter, using that connection to supercharge her powers and tear Danger apart. To me, that's the real point of Danger.exe. The episode isn't just adapting the old Danger Room Comes to Life storyline. It's using that crisis to lock in who Polaris is in this show, a true X-Man who carries Magneto's legacy in her power, but Xavier's influence in her heart. At this point, the least interesting thing about Polaris is simply that she moves metal, and don't get me wrong, I totally mean that as a compliment. What really grabs me is how her powers shape the way she sees the world, protects the people she loves, and forces her to keep asking who she wants to be, not who everyone expects her to become. That's why she's easily one of my favorite X-Men. If you enjoyed this anatomy of Polaris, go ahead and drop a like, share it with your fellow X-fans, and tell us in the comments which X-Man's anatomy you want us to break down next. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more dives into mutant madness.